Well, good evening. This is a repeat of our intended hangout talking about social justice, good or bad. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our books and authors later in the show, but I want us to start out, since we're talking about social justice, we're going to start out with the definition of the word justice. And defining the word justice may be a little harder than you expect. But we're going to let Elgin start. What is justice?
Well, in kind of a shorthand view, without getting too long, justice is getting what is due. It is getting what is what should happen in a particular situation. If you have been wronged, it is getting that set right. It is, the guilty getting punished. The good getting rewarded is basically in terms of we are all free creatures, or at least should be free creatures, and we should be able to act as that. And in as many respects, justice is just simply getting what is due.
Well, I guess we can conclude this discussion now, because I agree wholeheartedly with that.
Next topic, Henry.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't thrown the word social into the mix yet. But let's jump right to that. I have a feeling that you're going to want to nuance the definition a little bit by the time we're done talking about using the adjective social with justice. Because if I were to put on linguist hat, there's plenty of questions I could ask you about, determining what is due and justice, injustice in various circumstances. So let's just start. In your book, What is Wrong with Social Justice, you maintain that by the time justice is modified by the word social, it is no longer justice. So a little bit of the linguistic hat on. What is the definition of social, and how does that come together with justice to make, once we say social justice, that it is not, in fact, justice anymore?
Well, social is normally seen in terms of dealing with the community or the interactions between various peoples. When you put social justice as a single term, it really becomes almost a unique term, somewhat independent of its parts. And that's actually one of the big issues: is what is social justice? In theory, as I put in my book, in theory, it could just be a subset of justice applied in the social realm. But in practice, social justice is far different from that, and actually differs from justice in many ways. For example, just a couple of them. One of the ways is social justice tends to look more towards very subjective concepts like fairness, as opposed to objective concepts such as what is right, what is wrong in a particular situation, or what did a person lose or gain in a particular situation. They'll look at whether or not that was fair or not. The other thing is that social justice tends to be much more focused on groups as opposed to individuals. And in terms of looking at what happened between two individuals and whether there was a crime, or whether someone got the right punishment or didn't get the right punishment, social justice will often skip right over that and look at the larger group dynamics, and the actual events and the actual individuals almost become somewhat irrelevant in terms of the broader scope of social justice.
Okay,
Yeah.
Steve, let me just remind people we have the Q&A app active, so if audience questions or comments are welcomed. Steve, go ahead. I see the wheels turning there.
Well, justice per se, as I mentioned before, I agree wholeheartedly with Elgin. Those are the basics of justice. Now, to say that you can't break justice down into categories, I think is a mistake. And certainly there are two categories of justice that are constantly at play in our world and thoroughly a part of the Bible. That's distributive justice and retributive justice. These two kinds of justices are very different from each other and function in ways that are very different from each other. So that social justice is no different than saying, well, there's chemistry, there's only chemistry, there isn't organic chemistry, there isn't inorganic chemistry, or there's only physics, there's not astrophysics, there's not atomic physics. No, we have to have these discrete areas broken down because they cover different things in different ways. And social justice is one form of justice that is required in many situations that human beings are a part of. And I think they favor more the distributive justice side than the retributive justice side, which seem to occupy most of the justices you are looking at in your book, Elgin.
Yeah. My biggest problem with social justice is it's not in practice. Well, in theory, it could be a section of justice, but in practice, it's not. And in fact, oftentimes it's in conflict with actual justice, or what I call real justice, justice without a modifier. And thus the quotes I use in my book from Herb Cole, where arguing that the judge needs to put the finger on the scales to tip them in favor, because left to themselves, things wouldn't be the right outcome as he perceives it. And to me, that's not only wrong in terms of a violation of justice, it's unbiblical, because God tells us not to do that. He says, do not favor the poor and do not favor the rich. Judges are to make decisions based on the facts that are before them in that particular case. And that's justice.
That's judicial justice, which is a completely different category from social justice. So
I would agree it's different.
Yeah, because all throughout the Torah, God is saying, make room for the oppressed. Do things for them that you don't have to do for other people. That's God's notion of justice, is a distributive kind of justice that begins in Genesis 1, when God creates the world and peoples it with human beings and gives them this beautiful place for them to enjoy, and then really hammers it down when we get into the distribution of the land in Canaan, where everyone got a piece of land to call their own in perpetuity. It was never to be taken away from them under any circumstances. It could be loaned out. It could be returned to them then at the Jubilee years. God in the Torah, especially through Leviticus 25 and the Jubilee situation, is a God who demands that the people who follow him are a people who distribute justice fairly so that no one is left out. And that, to me, is the core of social justice, that everybody is entitled to a share in the wealth that God provides the world.
In that terms, I would agree with you, but I don't believe that in terms of that would boil down into practical concerns of it's just to take away from one person and give to another. If you look at all of these but if you look at the particular cases, you see that yes, we are called to help the poor. We are called to reach out to them. We're called to share our wealth with them. And in terms of that as a mandate on me, I agree with it. That's something that I try to live by, and I encourage others to. I don't believe that gives me a right to tell other people what to do with their money in that sense, and to take money away from them because I don't think a particular situation is fair.
Okay, there's the heart of the problem. You think it's their money. You think it's your money. It's not your money. It's not their money. It's God's money. It's money that God says, I will take away from you in a tithe. I will take away from you in land distribution. I will take away your ability to use this land that's been awarded to you through debt or whatever, and return it to its rightful steward in every 50 years. So it's not your money that we're taking away from you to give to somebody else. It's God's money in the first place. And if you equate taxes for social programs with theft, which you have written, then what you're saying is God is the biggest thief of all when he demanded his tithes so that the poor could have sustenance.
Well, for a couple different things here. One, I don't equate the government with God. So when the government does something, that's the government doing it. When God asks me to do something, that's a completely different concept. The other thing is I do have a moral issue with tax systems, but not with taxes in general. I have a problem when the burden on one person is different. I have my moral problem with taxes is when a group of people impose a burden on somebody else, on another party, that they do not wish to share themselves. And so they want to tax somebody else and they want them to pay for something, but they don't put the same burden on them. God, we can quibble back and forth as to whether God wants us to pay 10% or whatever the particular percentage is, but God doesn't lay out different percentages for different groups of people. And if you say the tithe, then everybody pays the tithe, regardless of whether they are wealthy or whether they're poor. Now, I would argue that the rich should be paying more in sense of as a duty to people, as to helping them out. Quite frankly, one of the interesting things is the people who oppose social justice tend to give much more than the people who support social justice. So, in terms of generosity and giving, the people who are opposing social justice are the people who are actually doing the giving, as opposed to letting the government take care of that for them.
Well, I think we're getting to the heart of the difference between you and me. You don't equate the government with God, nor do I. But I do understand that I am living in a commonwealth. I am living in a society that is a society that has been brought together under a social contract. The social contract says that I am not here just for me. I am not here for my benefit alone. That the things I do affect other people within my community, within my commonwealth. And I must, as I live my life, take into consideration the needs of others. And so our government, which is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, is a government that says that we are all in this together, and as all in this together, we take care of each other. The system we've got is a representative system where we elect people to do that business for us. And part of what they have to do for us is to ensure the welfare of everyone. And that requires a redistribution, like God required of Israel, of the wealth that made sure that everybody was taken care of. So the 19th century notion of liberalism that demanded the individual over the community is just flat not biblical. And it's harmful when we live in a society where it's every person for him or herself, so that we ignore the needs of other people when in fact we are a community. We are not just isolated individuals living side by side.
Well, I would argue, not too surprisingly, I have a vastly different view of government. I think that's one of the big things that we've lost from the 1930s and then again the 1960s. We lost what was distinctly unique about America, and we went from being a country where the founders believed that individuals should be free to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they don't bother their neighbors, and they allow them the same freedom to exactly what you've argued, more of a European collectivist idea where we all, the government is the master and we all serve the government, and then it redistributes to trying everything equal. I don't particularly like that mode. The other thing is I disagree that it's the previous mode was harmful. If you look at the advances in society, the advances that have been made, the massive elimination of poverty, of $1 a day poverty around the world, is a statistic I have in my book, has been cut 80%. That's not due through redistributive policies. In fact, redistributive policies were found to have been very harmful for that. It's the spread of entrepreneurs and things like microcredit that are building economic systems in these countries that have allowed that massive reduction in poverty. I don't believe that the large government, oftentimes I hear the argument, I'm not saying you've made this argument, I don't know if you would or not, but I oftentimes hear the argument that we can't just leave the poor to the churches and to charity because the problem's too big, government has to step in. I would argue almost the exact opposite, that government cannot solve the problem because of the inherent contradictions within government itself. That the bigger government gets, the less efficient it gets, the more corrupt it gets, and therefore it becomes an impossible problem as the government gets bigger and bigger and bigger, trying to solve more and more things. It becomes less and less effective.
Well, I'd like to corral us for just a second. I want to corral us back to a text. Hold that thought, because I'm sure Steve has a bunch of things he wants to reply to in there. But we were on the Torah law, and I just want to get some specific answers out of both of you before we completely leave it in perhaps the mazes of American history here. Leviticus chapter 19, and I'm going to read verses 9 and 10, and then give you some questions that I'd like to get answers from both of you, just to set the stage, and then we'll let you back, and Steve can get at Elgin for everything he just said. Okay? When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Now, a lot of people look at it and think it's fairly obvious, but I'm left here. Here's the questions that I want. Is this a law for Israel or a moral injunction for individuals? Does it in fact constitute redistribution in that only a percentage of the people of Israel were going to have edges of their field to leave for the aliens? They're being commanded to. Now, of course, whether that's an individual moral injunction or a law for Israel is another question. It seemed to me that saying certain amount of your crop must be set aside for the poor, and so I'm wondering those two things: is it a law, a moral suggestion? Is it a form of redistribution? And then the fourth point is, how does it apply, or if it does apply to us? Does it carry over in principle? How would you see those passages that I just quoted? Steve, you look like you want to. I'll give you the first shot at those, and then Elgin. Well, I'm just I think this is a concrete text to apply what you were just saying to.
Well, you're going to have to remind me of the four. I'm sure I'm going to miss some, but is it a law? Absolutely, it's a law. And I don't know where you got the idea that this is a minority situation in Israel, because of mostly rural. It was mostly farming. And it applied to most of the people of Israel, and it was applied because they didn't own their land. They were stewards of that land. It was to be done in such a way that everybody benefited from God's gift of the land to Israel. The issue here, yes, is it for everybody? Is it for everyone today? I look at it like this. Israel's election was to be a light to the nations. And the psalmist and Isaiah all proclaim that Israel's responsibility before God was to live in such a way as God had outlined, that once the world got a picture of what was going on in Israel, the world would clamor to be a part of this wonderful society, a society of righteousness and justice. And of course, the Levitical laws, other laws of the Torah, were meant to be the template for why this could possibly be. And of course, human greed and other things always come into play that make the picture not as successful as it could have been. But the point is that this kind of living in a society, a community that is lived for each other, not just for themselves, works itself out in the ways that the crops are left there for the poor, as just one example. So that's God's view of how the world should work, and it's the view of how I think we should be comporting ourselves in our world today.
Okay, before I pass that back to Elgin, I want to clarify one thing. I did not mean by saying minority, or rather, I understand that Israel was largely rural and farmers, but what we have here is clearly there is a portion of the population that has land and has excess that they are capable of leaving in the corner of the fields. Otherwise, you wouldn't have anybody, namely the poor and the alien, to come and pick it up. And that was the fourth point that I was asking. Does this constitute a case of redistribution of wealth?
Absolutely.
Which I follow that you're saying yes.
Yes, indeed. It's a way of the greedy farmer, and I'm sure there were some, if not many, would want to capture that for himself, but is demanded by God not to do that, so as to redistribute what might have been the farmers to those needy instead.
Okay, and you're saying you would call this a law of the land, basically a law for Israel, not simply a moral or a moral suggestion or even moral imperative for individuals.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Sorry to hold you off there, Elgin. Go ahead and go ahead.
Well, I think there's considerable agreement on a lot of what Steve said, but I would highlight a couple of different points. I mean, I'm up here in central Wisconsin, where there's a lot of farming around me. If we were talking about fields in the way that they described them there, I don't think we would have anywhere near the issue that we have in our current system. The other thing is, I would not consider it redistribution. They're basically saying, that you're going to leave, if you were to put it in terms of a dinner, you're leaving the scraps. So you're not going to wipe your plate clean so there's nothing left. So in that sense, in the larger picture, I would agree. There is a moral imperative that we are given that we need to help the poor. And I don't think personally I agree. The money we receive is ultimately everything we get is from God. And as a Christian, I believe that my resources are God's resources, and they're a gift from God. Even in terms of the places where I've worked hard to get where I'm at, I acknowledge that I have gifts from God, that God has blessed me. I seem to be able to write computer code and seem to be able to do it well, and that's not everybody has that gift. Other people have gifts that I don't have. So in that sense, I agree. And as a Christian, have an obligation. Where I begin to question is when we take the agricultural setting of Israel and we move it into the modern setting today, and then we say that we're going to take our concepts of what God has commanded us and we're going to write them into the laws of the land, and we're going to impose them on people who may not be Christians or may not share the same values that we have. But we're going to impose that on the state, and essentially it's, I'm imposing if I was to do it, I'd be imposing my religious views and my religious obligations on them. And so I do have a problem with that, and the fact that, quite honestly, I don't think it works. I don't think the state can do that. I think private charities and gifts to the poor are a far better way of handling those situations than the state, which has shown itself to be thoroughly incompetent.
Well, tell that to President Hoover. If it wasn't for Roosevelt's New Deal, charities would not have made a dent in the issues facing America at the time. But let's get back to your statement before.
Well, real quick comment on that. I would agree with you. Hoover pursued extremely wrong-headed problems, but then I would argue that Roosevelt, while he gave a lot of PR positives, ultimately made things even worse, particularly for the country in the long term. When you look at the deepest part of the recession, you should read Amity Slade's The Forgotten Man. The deepest part of the recession was in 1937, after Roosevelt had been in office for many years. The idea that Roosevelt came in and solved the problem is literally a myth. The problem overall was in Hoover and in Roosevelt caused by government intervention, and it was only when World War II took over and basically distracted them from looking at the economy and let the economy go on its own that it actually took off again.
All right, well, to get back to your comments before we were sidetracked here, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it was very useful for us to do that. And actually feeding off what you just said now as well. I don't want a theocracy. I don't want the Torah to become the official law of the United States. But I want to take the examples of what God thinks is a just society and help inform America along the same lines. And this is what I mean. Pardon me. One of our founding documents says that governments are formed to promote the common welfare. Now,
general welfare, but yes.
General or common, it can also, it's a synonym. Promote the general welfare, that's the exact phrase. That is the notion that we are living in community, that we are responsible for the livelihood of each other as well as our own. And in order to do that as a government, we operate where we have to enact laws that involve redistribution, because the poor don't have it, because those who have it aren't willing to share. So we need some way of having a redistribution of our commonwealth that helps those without to at least subsist, if not thrive. It's a common, we are in a society that has a social contract to take care of each other. And to leave it to a voluntary system just doesn't work.
Well, again, we can get into a couple of different things here. One, the concept of general welfare as put into the Constitution initially was not the description that you just described. That was actually changed in the 1930s in the Supreme Court case. Basically, if you look at the Constitution has the enumerated powers, and it goes through, and lists all those powers as to what the government can do and what it can't do, and to argue that we need to have a redistribution based on general welfare is again, that is one of the very destructive changes that came in the 1930s. And there isn't a single, well, it's actually Hamilton argued for it, but he didn't argue for it during the ratification process because he knew it would never have passed. So he only 2 years after the ratification process did he begin to mention his view of general welfare, which was vastly different from all the other founding fathers. But going back to the government cannot do this. It just, every place it tries, it fails. You look at Social Security. Social Security is going to go bankrupt in 2030. It's structurally unsound. If you look at the VA, the way they're my entire life, I've heard from a military family, so maybe I've clued into this a bit more. But for my entire life, I've heard about problems at the VA. Barack Obama ran on improving the problems in the VA, and we're still having problems in the VA. It's structurally incapable of dealing with even a small little self-contained section like that. And it's not that the people are bad. It's not anything like that. It's just that the government is the way it works, or doesn't work, is structurally unsound, largely because it doesn't have a profit motive. If you look at large corporations, they have a profit motive. If they don't restructure themselves to adapt to changing forces, they go out of business, as many of them have. Or they morph into something vastly different. I know when I was a kid in the 60s, we had lots of major stores like Sears and Woolworth. Most of those stores are gone now. They're replaced by other things. Government doesn't have that constraint. And therefore, if you look at the modern corporation, modern large corporation will have about 6 layers of bureaucracy. The average government the average federal government has 22 layers of bureaucracy. What are all those 22 layers doing? They're consuming a lot of resources and are basically being wasted, and the ultimate problem does not actually get addressed.
You seem to have a lot of faith in the profit motive and capitalism, yet supercapitalism is turning out to be one of the biggest enemies not only of the United States, but of the world in general. Where they are,
I'm not familiar with that term. Can you define supercapitalism?
The corporations that are so large that they exist throughout the world and have no particular government to restrain them. So that the large oil companies, for instance, and the pharmaceuticals, these companies are raping and pillaging the earth, and in doing so, because there's no way to harness them, they are causing innumerable problems in especially the developing countries, where most of the profit that they make is extracted from and then not redistributed, not done anything with it except put out in their corporate profits. So there is a certain level where, the small businesses function in the way you're describing, but there's another function where if we didn't, you recall the robber barons of the 19th century. I mean, if it wouldn't have been for Teddy Roosevelt and his efforts at breaking the monopolies, we'd have 4 or 5 companies in the United States right now. All doing super well, and everybody else having to be their employees. And it wouldn't have been in the finest positions either. So it's a mixed bag as well. Yes, government has its problems. So does our economic system in general have its problems. The answer is not to prefer one over the other, but to make both of them work the way they're supposed to. And that can't be done without some kind of an organizing, regulating power to step in and take care of the issues as they arise. Hey, we've got the best Congress money can buy. I understand that. They are bought and paid for
On that we pretty much agree.
by the big corporations. I saw an idea the other day that our congressmen should do what the race drivers do and have on their suits all the logos of the people that supply them their money. It's abominable how much the larger corporations control the outcomes of the United States. That's a problem not of government, but of corporate power getting more powerful than the government itself. So I don't see capitalism in its larger sense anymore an answer to bad government than the people ultimately coming together and deciding that we need to clean house and take care of business.
Okay, and Elgin, I'm going to cut you off this time.
Okay.
And then give you a chance to respond to all of that, because we do need to have the moment in this hangout when I introduce the authors. And I'm talking tonight with Elgin Hushbeck Jr. He's the author of several books. I first encountered him as a Christian apologist, author of the books Evidence for the Bible and Christianity and Secularism, both of which are still available along with study guides. And then the book Preserving Democracy, which expresses, of course, a number of the views that he's talking about tonight. And most recently, we're working with the book What is Wrong with Social Justice, which is part of our Topical Line Drives series here at Energion Publications, which are books that go straight to the point in less than 44 pages, which is somewhat challenging. And so Elgin wrote What is Wrong with Social Justice, giving the basics of his view. Steve Kindle is a retired, I believe you're retired, aren't you, Steve?
Yep.
Disciples of Christ minister. He has written for Energion Publications 2 of our Topical Line Drives. One of those is titled I'm Right and You're Wrong, Why We Disagree About the Bible and What to Do About It. And the other is called Stewardship, God's Way of Creating the World. Recreating, I'm sorry. We give these, even get the subtitles wrong as I'm going through this. Steve is also the head of the group Clergy United and author of self-published books, including If Your Child is Gay, which we're looking toward issuing a new edition of next year. So I just wanted to introduce both of them, and then I will hand this back to Elgin to respond. I hope you were able to keep your fires burning there while I did the introductions and commercials, and you're still ready to go at it. Go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that you talked. Obviously, there's a lot there. Try me hit some of the high points. You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. One of the quotes I have in my book about him is he points out how it's not always the corporations, in his case the big railroads, that are seeking to corrupt government. I have the example that he cites of government refusing to act on something that everybody wanted until the appropriate people got paid off within the government. So that's one of the issues. It really is a two-way street. As government gets bigger and bigger and regulates more and more, the interest in government that corporations take and the demand for that interest that government insists upon grows to the point that corruption becomes basically inevitable. Also, as government gets bigger and bigger, you have a situation we have now, which is the regulations don't actually do. I mean, it sounds real good to say we're going to pass a law that's going to regulate. We passed Dodd-Frank, for example. It's got 2,200 pages. It's not even going to have the regulations written. It was passed several years ago, and the final regulations won't even be written until 2020 when it's merged in. And ultimately, what that law is doing is it's making it minor inconvenience for the larger banks, but it's running the smaller banks out of business, where up until Dodd-Frank, you had on average about 100 small banks putting in and starting up each year to basically open their doors. Since Dodd-Frank, in the I think it's 4 years since Dodd-Frank, it's not been 100 per year, it's been 1, because the small banks can no longer function. And this is what you find with so much government regulation. The bigger companies are the only ones that can afford to hire the lawyers to navigate the bureaucratic mazes, and therefore they're the only ones that can actually function. The smaller ones get run out of business because stupid rules. Like, for example, it's an actual, I know it sounds silly, but it's an actual case that was taken up to the Supreme Court and they lost, where a company was fined because they didn't put a sign on a door, a storage room, marking it as containing poison. What was in the room? Sand. But because sand contained silicate, and silicate was actually considered a poison by the EPA, because they didn't label the room containing the sand as poisonous, they got fined. And there's a deference to the regulators that courts just won't deal with, and therefore, you have the Sackett case. I don't know if you're familiar with that in Idaho, where a couple wanted to build a house. They bought some land, started building it. The EPA showed up one day and just said, you've got to restore the land, and if you don't restore it, then you're liable to fines of $34,000 a day, I believe it was. And they were told they could not even take that to the Supreme Court. They ultimately did. They couldn't take it to the court system. They ultimately did, but they didn't take the ruling to the system. They took it to the court system to see if they even had the right to sue. And the EPA, they had to fight that all the way up to the Supreme Court before the Supreme Court finally said, yeah, you do have the right to actually go to a court of law and see if you can win there. I still don't know if they've been able to build their house. But it's not the big people or the big corporations that are reined in by government regulation. It is the little people. It's the people like the farmer in the 1930s who was told he couldn't grow wheat on his own farm for his own consumption because that somehow violated interstate commerce. So this is where a lot of it sounds real good when we say we're going to have the government write a regulation, but in ultimate practice, it virtually never does what they want it to do.
Well, Elgin, you use a lot of words like never when never is not appropriate. Often might be preferred over never.
I thought I said virtually never, but if I slipped up, I would agree with that. There's occasional, but rare.
I don't know where you live, but
Wisconsin.
Where I live and walk down the street, there's a plethora of small businesses. Everywhere, every town I go to has got small businesses abounding. As a matter of fact, I think America is like 90% small business relative to the numbers of the big businesses versus small businesses.
I agree with that.
So it isn't that small businesses are somehow going out of business and they're being all emerged into the larger businesses. In some cases they are, especially the bookstores, things of that nature. But small businesses are hampered by regulation, no question about it. We are an overly regulated nation. I would agree with you about that. But I would prefer that to a laissez-faire economy, a libertarian economy, where everyone is able to do as they please, and we would not have zoning laws. We would not be able to have food inspected. There would be no restraints on gobbling up whatever anybody wanted to take because they had the ability to do so. Regulation is necessary. It is extravagant today. A friend of mine once said, pretty soon, if it's not illegal, it's going to be regulated. And we're getting very close to that. Yet at the same time, I would not want to live in a nation where might makes right. And if you can get away with it, more power to you. We need some form of government that's able to take care of a sensible reaction to problems that we have. We don't have that right now, I'd agree. But I don't want the alternative anymore. As a matter of fact, I don't want the alternative at all.
Well, in my book, I make a big distinction between laissez-faire and conservatism. I'm not against government regulation, but as I point out in my book, there are two ways government could approach certain issues. One is, and the way they normally do it, is a very sort of 19th century way, I would argue, of an authoritarian, top-down, highly bureaucratic approach where they are going to issue regulations and you're going to follow those regulations. That I just don't believe works, and I think we're struggling with it now. I think one of the problems we had with the current economy, with 93 million people out of the workforce, and the economy just contracted in the first quarter this year again, and if it does it 2 quarters in a row, we're technically into a recession. I don't think it's any coincidence that since 2008, we've seen a massive increase in government regulation and a massive explosion in government debt, and I think that's dragging down the economy. So I think rather than, again, I don't think we should go to laissez-faire. I do believe in government regulation, but government should be regulating to encourage competition and choice. It shouldn't be out there with a 300-page book, which there is, telling dentists what they need to do to run a dentist's office. The American Dental Society is very good at deciding what dentists need to do and what dentists don't need to do to be able to run an office. What we have now is a situation where I was a professor up in New York, wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day, where he argues there's so much regulation, as you pointed out, that the average citizen on any day commits 3 felonies. And essentially we're in a situation where if the government wants to go after you, they can. Now granted, there's so many businesses that they don't target every single business. And so a lot of them drift along until the inspectors show up on their doorstep. And some businesses just take it as a cost of doing business. Restaurants, for example, they know when the health inspector shows up, they're going to get dinged for something, and that's just part of the cost of doing business. Like the restaurant that got dinged for having its cheese at 45 degrees instead of 41 degrees, even though the reason it was 45 degrees is because it had been brought out of the refrigerator and set next to the stove to put on hamburgers. So that's the sort of thing that, does that really make us any safer? No. But
things like that do, though. I'm glad that dentists regulation that they have to wear gloves when they work on me. That seems to make a lot of sense, and I'm sure there are other regulations involved in that list that you were talking about that have to do with my safety. There's probably some superfluous ones as well.
There are.
So I'd like to ask you about a quote that I think bears on what you just said here from your book, on page 52 or 32.
I was going to say, can't have a page 52. It's not allowed to.
Not in a,
That's in the secret special edition.
Okay, you're making me put my glasses on. Such economic systems have a lot of inequality, but in exchange provide us a vast number of choices for questions as simple as, what do we want for dinner tonight? What do we who can afford dinner, want? We want that kind of a government that makes it, or an economic system that makes it possible for me to have choices, but for a whole number of people that have no choices. That dinner tonight is whatever is down at the local union hall or at the gospel mission. That to me seems okay. Choices, you just mentioned, it provides numerous choices, absolutely, but at what cost? if not everyone is accessible, if not all of those choices are accessible by everyone, then, as Martin Luther King would say, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. We are all suffering because others are suffering, and that requires a huge exegesis to understand that, but I think people get the point. We can't allow in our society people to go hungry, to go without health care, to be set aside because of the economic situation they're in as not deserving. And I used to, years ago, let's say 15 years ago, I used to put a tagline on my email that said, when 3 to 5%, that was back then, 3 to 5% unemployment is required for our economic system to work, then it is our moral obligation as a nation to take care of those displaced for the sake of the economy. Now it's more like 6%. The way our system works is, well, too bad for you people who got displaced. Figure it out on yourself. Maybe a church will give you something. I think a better way is for the people who are living together in our communities to make sure through redistribution that everyone has at least a subsistence level.
I'm not disagreeing with the subsistence level. However, I would argue that actually the unemployment rate, it's just, to me, it's very interesting that in this whole last 6 years, it's been the liberals who have been pointing to the lower figure and the conservatives have been pointing to the higher figure. Actual unemployment is upwards closer to 12 to 15%. And it's at that level, I believe, because of the federal government. This whole economic crisis started because of the federal government. If you look back, it came from the housing market, and I trace this in my book, Preserving Democracy. I trace it back to the housing programs by the federal government, the demand that the federal government issue loans to high-risk loans to people who normally wouldn't have qualified for them. Again, for the whole sake of equality, so everybody could own a home. But the problem is they issued loans to people who were undeserving of them. They could not afford them, and therefore all they did was get themselves into problems. And yet the government was arguing for more and more of these loans. 2007, as this crisis was cresting and things were beginning to fall apart, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac didn't even meet their quotas for how many high-risk loans they were supposed to have overwritten because they couldn't find enough people to give them to. So that's what was the origin of the whole economic problem. We then approached it. There was actually an accounting issue going in, also put in by the accounting board, but we also approached it by throwing big money, big TARP program, and then we had the stimulus, and then we had massive increases in the government and regulation, such that, no wonder we've had this much problem. We basically are repeating exactly the problems that we did in the not exactly, let me avoid over precision. We are largely following along the same lines of what we did in the 1930s. We're doing a little better, but that's only because the Federal Reserve has been printing money like mad, and thus we've increased the money supply fourfold. I really worry about how we are going to get out of this, because we are $17 trillion in debt. We have $100 trillion in unfunded liability, promises that politicians have made that they haven't even put out there to how they're going to pay for them yet. And we've got a massive overprinting of money that is the only reason we haven't seen inflation is because the economy has been doing so poorly. When that all comes together, I really fear for what's going to happen. And it's not because big businesses out there. I mean, I always wonder, you mentioned the oil companies before. I've always been perplexed why people are so worried about the oil companies. that make about 9 cents on a gallon, whereas government makes up to 50 cents on a gallon. Why aren't we worried about big government when they're the ones that are really reaping all the profits, and the oil companies are only getting a small fraction of what the government gets out of oil? So to me, government is the problem, and bigger government. You can say we're going to have these programs, but I would rather have less programs and more jobs. We had a major downturn in the economy in 1987, but we didn't get in there. I remember Reagan was severely criticized for not stepping in and doing something. He stood back. Nowadays, most people don't even remember the crash of '87, but because the economy came right back and continued on and continued to generate jobs. And I think that's where the government should be focusing on. How do you create jobs? And you don't do it by punishing the people who create them.
Okay, Elgin, we're looking at the time, and based on the length of what you just said, I think we're pretty much going to have to call that closing, and we'll let Steve. I started with you. We'll let Steve close now because there's just 4 minutes left, and there's a lot of material in there. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, we can debate the place of government in America. To some extent, I think we're very close in agreement that our government is out of hand. There's no question about it. But the answer isn't to do away with the regulating authorities, and particularly those regulations that have to do with making sure that America is an equal opportunity place. Excuse me. I take my cues from what I think God wants for the world. And I take that to the marketplace of ideas, the public square in America, and I talk to people about how God, in my view, wants to see the world run. And I see America as a place where much of that is happening due to progressive income tax, for instance, welfare programs. By the way, this 3 to 5% that used to obtain is mandated for the economy to run properly. It cannot run at 100% employment. That vehicle is impossible, and so the moral obligation remains that the unemployed, Reagan says, let them move to where the jobs are. Yeah, really? Uproot your home, your family, your associations, and take off across the United States? No. That's asking too much when they didn't create the problem. The problem was created by the American capitalist system, which needs to be regulated in such a way that those displaced individuals are taken care of. How that's done, as you point out very well, not so well. But the issue isn't do away with it. I think the issue is to put more pressure on people who make these decisions to make sure that justice is the order of the day, fairness and equality, not looking to the big money, but to the actual on-the-ground results for people who otherwise have been set aside. And I think that's how God would like to see America comport itself.
Okay, well, I'm sure that Elgin would really love the opportunity to respond to the trio there of justice, fairness, and equality. But I'm out of time, and I'm not going to let him do that.
Thank you.
I will let our audience know that it's a real good idea for a fine hangout discussion has come to my mind as we were doing this, and you're likely to hear some more about it. Thanks again to Elgin Hushbeck. The book, What is Wrong with Social Justice? We just mentioned the one here at the end, and Steve Kindle, Stewardship, God's Way of Recreating the World. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Good night.